Hi everyone, this is Sarah Butler from Faith Trust Institute. I want to thank you for joining us for our Meaningful Voices book club tonight. We're delighted you're here. We're going to get started really quickly, just go over a few technical things. First of all, you should be able to hear me as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with the sound, please check to make sure that your speakers or headphones are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you're having other technical problems, I recommend you exit the webinar, return to the link in your email, and then try to connect again. All the audience members are muted. We would love to hear from you, however, so if you have questions, you can submit them to me using the question feature on the right side of your screen. You can submit your questions anytime during the presentation. If you don't see the question box, you can click on the small orange arrow, which is on the right side of your screen, and that will expand the feature options. We also have a new feature that we're testing out tonight, which is the hand raise icon that's located below the orange arrow. And so if you have a microphone and would like to ask your question directly to the presenters, just lift your hand and I will try to unmute you, though we'll see how that goes. This is a technical, who knows. We want to welcome everyone here tonight. Let's see here. Whoops. So Elena, are you going to introduce folks?
I would love to introduce folks. I have had the honor and privilege of working with Dr. Donald Clark for a very long time now, and I consider him both friend and gentle peer. Donald Clark has retired from IHS in 2013 after 24 years of working with IHS. He worked on Navajo and on Jemez Pueblo, where he became interested originally in public health and epidemiology. He realized at that time, and he was way ahead of his time, that domestic violence is a healthcare issue while working at Albuquerque IHS, and obtained a master's in public health focusing on the healthcare response to domestic violence. He has worked for 18 plus years helping other hospitals, clinics develop protocols to address domestic violence. And for the last 4 years, I've had the privilege of working with him doing the same with tribal clinics. More recent focus is raising awareness of traumatic brain injury and strangulation in domestic violence. He is a good man. He has worked and walks in a humble and gentle way with our community. It's my pleasure and honor to have Dr. Donald Clark as part of our group tonight. I'd also like to introduce Sarah Deer, one of our sheroes of all of our community. Sarah is Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. She's a legal scholar and an advocate leveraging deep understanding of tribal and federal law to develop policies and legislation that empower tribal nations and to protect Native women. She's been worked to end violence against women for over 20 years. She began, like I began, as a volunteer rape victim advocate and as an undergraduate, and later received her JD with a tribal lawyer certificate from the University of Kansas School of Law. She is currently a professor in Minnesota, and her latest book is The Beginning and End of Rape, Confronting Sexual Violence in Native America. In 2007, she spearheaded Amnesty International report, The Maze of Injustice, which was huge in our community. And she framed the problem of sexual violence in Indian country as an international human rights issue. She has brought Native American leaders, health specialists, advocates, doctors around the intersection between violence against women and tribal governance to reform policies that interfere with the ability of tribes to prosecute offenders, which is a lot about what this book is about. Sarah's efforts were instrumental in the passage of 2 landmark pieces of legislation: the Tribal Law and Order Act of 2010, which increased the sentencing power of tribal courts and requires federal district attorneys to provide detailed information to tribal authorities about cases under their jurisdiction, and the 2013 reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which restored some of the authority that was from the tribal governments by Oliphant and Squamish, which again came up in this book. She's an honorable woman, a Native sister, a hero who continues to change the course of history of our nations and people. It is, and if anybody can understand tribal jurisdiction, this is the woman, Sarah Deer.
Thank you. So I'm introducing Elena. Elena Giacci has been doing this work for over 26 years. And she has worked primarily as an advocate, and probably with a capital A, I would say. And certainly is very well known and respected as a real advocate in every context she works in. She's worked particularly on historical trauma and continues to teach about that. And much of what she has learned over the years in doing the work is really from the people she has worked with and who have shared their lives with her. I've known Elena for at least the last 20 years, and we've been working on various projects here and there during those 20 years, and I have come to deeply appreciate and respect her and her work and her friendship. So we welcome Elena tonight.
Thank you.
And we would also like to welcome Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune. She's the founder and senior analyst at Faith Trust Institute. She's written extensively on sexual violence and clergy misconduct. Her work is considered foundational in addressing the issues of sexual and domestic violence within both faith communities and secular advocacy organizations. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm going to begin with kind of introducing our process here. For the Meaningful Voices book club, we are always looking for books that talk about the intersection of sexual and domestic violence and religion or spirituality. And so we welcome any recommendations from our listeners. If you have any thought about that, send us an email about something you may be aware of that we might not, and we'll consider it as a selection for the book club. This book, The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich, is our first fiction selection, which I anticipated being challenging because I'm more used to dealing with nonfiction and kind of this kind of conversation. But it hasn't been challenging at all in terms of how well it represents our concerns and the possibilities of our discussion. So we're going to begin with just a quick check-in with each of our panelists in terms of their response to the novel itself. And if you would just say a little bit about how it affected you, what you thought about it, what response you make to the novel as a whole. Sarah, would you like to start?
Sure. First of all, thanks again for inviting me to participate. I have to confess that it's very rare for me to read a novel, and it was just sort of like what you were saying, is that most of my work is done in the nonfiction world, and so I read about one novel a year maximum, and I found this book so effective at portraying the reality that it almost read like a textbook at times. And I actually assigned it. I teach a course called Feminist Jurisprudence, and I actually assigned this book to my students in a law school course. You don't read a lot of novels in law school, but that's how powerful and important I think it is.
I would agree. Dr. Clark, what about you?
Well, I haven't read all of Louise Erdrich's books, but I've been a fan of hers for a long time, and found this. I read this a few years ago and just found so much more in it on second reading. I agree as far as the portrayals of the jurisdictional issues. I have seen that in places I have worked on various reservations where a woman does not even attempt to contact any law enforcement, tribal or otherwise, when she's been sexually assaulted, just because she knows it's not going to go anywhere. So I believe Sarah Deer pointed out that, well, as many people have, that the reporting of rape and sexual violence in Indian country against women is probably vastly underreported, and that fits with my experience too. As far as this particular book goes, the thing I enjoyed about the most is just kind of my amazement that an adult of either gender could write from the perspective of a 13-year-old boy so well. I really just thought it was very genuine, the way she portrayed what the main character was thinking and how he acted.
Yeah, I agree very much. So Elena, what about you?
You know, I think so much of what was in this book is kind of what I do, how I live, the types of things that go on. The sadness and the frustration and the rage that is attached to whether it be a survivor who is walking through this knowing what Donald Clark was just talking about, that there's no reason to even say that this happened anymore because so little prosecution is being done in our community. And then the rage that a family member would have that nothing is being done, and this person might indeed spend a lot of time in the bedroom doing nothing but rolling up into a small ball because of the damage that has been done. And so I think reading it only reminds me of how much more work we have to do in our communities and how much more work needs to be done outside of communities that have the tendrils of all of our laws wrapped up in a pretty big mush, like that big lasagna with, you know, all of the forks and the spoons on top of it. And I thought, wow, that is, you know, it's a real great visual because, you know, it starts with this foundation that's rotting and smelly and has difficulty, and our laws have, and our treaties and all of those components have very much been taken over, and, you know, having our own destiny be treated in such a insignificant way, and our laws and our people, it just is a reminder of what's going on in our communities.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of a snapshot of so much more.
Mm-hmm.
And I would agree that that's something that Erdrich has done very well for all of us. I found it very powerful, of course, and intriguing in terms of the way in which she was able not only to give voice to Joe, the 13-year-old, but the complexity of the family, the community, the legal issues, really remarkable, I think, how she was able to portray all that in one novel. In the novel, the year is 1988, and we begin the novel with the rape of a Native woman named Geraldine by a white man named Lyndon on the Ojibwe reservation. But much more as we proceed into the novel is the coming of age of Geraldine's son, Joe, who is 13 at this time. And particularly, I was struck by following his loss of innocence and what he had to deal with during this summer following the rape of his mother. The focus is on the impact of the rape on Geraldine, her husband, Bazil, and who is a tribal court judge, and their son, Joe. All are changed forever by the rape that Geraldine experiences. So let's go now to the PowerPoint, because we have some statistics that give us kind of the larger picture of what we're dealing with here. Studies have consistently shown American Indian women experience much higher levels of sexual violence than other women. More than 1 in 2 American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced sexual violence. 1 in 3 Native women will be raped in her lifetime. 86% of rapes and sexual assaults are perpetrated by non-Native men. We'll get to that later as part of the legal struggle. In 2008, CDC studied 39% of Native women surveyed identified as victims of intimate partner violence in their lifetime, which is a rate higher than any other race or ethnicity survey. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, Department of Justice, at least 70% of the violent victimizations experienced by American Indians are committed by persons not of the same race. Again, higher than experienced by white or black victims. So this is kind of the big picture context that Erdrich is really writing about in the story that she tells. So let's go to the next slide. So this is kind of the outline we're going to work on tonight in looking at the book, and so we'll be following this from here on out. Erdrich said in an interview that justice was always the seminal issue in the book Roundhouse. And she seems to proceed to address justice on two levels. And the first is the issue of jurisdiction. And then later on, we'll talk about the issue of justice in terms of religion and spirituality that emerges. But the first issue of jurisdiction, because Geraldine is blindfolded when she is assaulted, she doesn't know for sure where the rape took place. She does know, but cannot disclose until later in the book, that she was raped by a white man. Joe's father, in explaining the legal issues to his son, summarizes on page 229. And I just want to cite this. We want the right to prosecute criminals of all races on all lands within our original boundaries. Sarah, what is the current status of this struggle that is articulated by Joe's father?
Well, it frankly hasn't changed. Even though we've had some improvements in federal law, it would not touch this particular type of crime. And the biggest roadblock is the fact that the perpetrator is non-Indian. That's the case of Oliphant versus Suquamish, which was decided in 1978, and is still good law when it comes to sexual violence. So even if they were able to determine exactly where this crime happened, they still would not be able, if it was on tribal lands, they still would not be able to prosecute today in 2016.
So what about the Violence Against Women Act extension part of that? What was accomplished in that does not speak to this?
Thank you. That's a really important question, because I think sometimes we tend to conflate, I mean, not we, but as a society, we tend to conflate domestic violence and sexual violence. And there's a really important distinction here with what Congress did. Native women have been going to Congress for a very long time and complaining about this case, Oliphant versus Suquamish, and weren't really heard until the Amnesty report was released and they suddenly saw a human rights organization sort of looking back at them. But Native women have said, we need a fix for Oliphant. We need our tribal governments wherever possible to be able to take action no matter who the perpetrator is. And the pushback on that has been, I think, founded in racism and oppression. The kinds of things that you hear people say, lawmakers say, when you say this is a problem, they kind of start to get worried about the idea that a white man would be held accountable by a tribal court. And there's really no, I think, legal basis for that argument. It's really based in the concern that brown people can't be fair. And that's my experience. So the Violence Against Women Act of 2013 was really the first time that we had a number of lawmakers that were like, yes, we need to do something about non-Indian perpetrators, because the data is, there's no contrary data. The data shows that most Native women are experiencing the violence at the hands of non-Indians. So when we went to Congress to try to work on this, of course, we wanted to fix Oliphant for all crimes. It doesn't matter with this domestic violence, sexual violence, or tribe abuse. The only thing that we could get to stick, and it got very political and very bipartisan, like very partisan, was the domestic violence piece. So some tribes are only able to prosecute non-Indians if they commit an act against an intimate partner. So this particular case where it's a stranger, even if they were able to determine where the crime happened, the tribe would still lack jurisdiction in 2016 because it's not domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize that. I thought it really covered both when it came down. Elena, what would you like to add to that?
It's really, I think when you take a look at that, and this progression, this one piece for the domestic violence component really is a move forward in a very backward step of doing so much. And what was really interesting when those processes started and we were really looking at being able to do something in our own communities, the racism that this particular act and the scrutiny by non-natives and the things that were said, it was like, well, they can't do this fairly because they might be all native people judging us. And not that when we go into other community cities and everything else, that I wouldn't say rarely are we judged by our own peers, and somehow we think that justice system is way okay. And they also don't understand the nature of our reservations and who makes up and who's on those reservations as well. But I think it's really frustrating when you look at this small piece, and it's a step in the right direction, and it's people like Sarah Deer who did testimony and helped that move forward, and all of our founding mothers that helped move this forward. But it's still such a small step when you think that it would be like if I came in your own home and raped you, and then it was like, well, but it was, even though it was your own home, sorry, it doesn't make a difference. And that's, when you think of it like that, that's what's happening in our own homes, in our reservations.
Mm-hmm. Don, what about your experience of what problems this creates?
Well, the people who limited it to domestic violence, I was not aware of that either. Certainly weren't looking at this as a health problem. Domestic violence we're still learning all the health effects that trail after domestic violence, a violent relationship. And at least in my experience, the effects of sexual violence are even worse. Maybe similar effects, but a greater degree. So that's clearly the thinking behind this was not based on any kind of, I don't think there were any doctors in the room, I guess that's what I'm getting at. The other thing I think that was pointed out very well in this book is to just think about the effects on men who are supposed to be protectors of families and their wives and girlfriends, etc., how impotent this makes someone feel when they can't even go to court and attempt to do that in any legal way, as well as in the greater effect on tribes themselves when they cannot have jurisdiction in their own lands, what's left of their own lands.
Is it fair to say that non-Indian perpetrators, some non-Indian perpetrators, are well aware of this reality and go onto reservations knowing that they will not be held accountable?
Absolutely.
I've noticed that, and I think that was brought up in the Amnesty International report. Was that Sarah Deer? that many of these perpetrators went to Indian lands knowing that even if they were caught, they would probably, the chances of prosecution were negligible.
And I think,
If not zero. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry I interrupted. We know that pedophiles are, can be very, very intelligent, and they can research the laws. And that's why it's sort of, I don't know, a Native woman sort of confronted me about this about 1.5 years ago when she said, would you stop telling the story of Oliphant and how white people can come onto our reservation? She felt that putting that out there was sort of a dangerous thing to do, but it's, how are we going to fix it if we don't talk about it? Yeah. But I do think there are people, predators, that research the law. We know that organized crime does, because they set up their meth labs on Indian reservations, and they do that intentionally. So if a drug trafficking ring can do that research and make the decision of what's the least risky place to go, there's no reason that predators can't do the same thing, and it's very scary.
When you think of that, prior to, just a few years ago, excuse me, when finally the reservations did sex offender registry, prior to that, what happened was exactly what we were talking about. Perpetrators went on reservation land and didn't have to register. So we saw an influx of sexual predators going on to reservation lands, and the crimes that they committed, you can just imagine. And our community is still reeling from that. And only just recently did we start requiring that you had to register on reservation land. But prior to that, our predators, our perpetrators, are very wise, and talking about it like Sarah does is giving a broader education to a community that needs to hear it. But the predators, they know it. They've known it for hundreds of years, and they continue to know what the susceptibility of our women are. So there's absolutely no secret from our predators.
So Sarah, what do you think is the next step in terms of addressing this as a legal issue?
Well, there's already work underway for the next version of VAWA, which I think right now is aimed for 2018, if I'm not mistaken. And we've already started a dialogue with the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs and some folks in the House about expanding this, if nothing else, expanding this fix to include child abuse. Right now, there are tribal prosecutors that are prosecuting non-Indians for domestic violence, but if they do something to endanger the child, the prosecutor can't charge that because it's not domestic violence under the definition of federal law. So we are asking for child abuse and all of the sort of permutations of that, which could include trespass, terroristic threats, property damage, right? Those kinds of things. And it seems to me that Congress is, like Elena said, it's like a baby step. And it seems that Congress is more receptive to the idea that these are white men that have married and had babies with tribal members. But once you start talking about a white man that has no ties to the reservation, sort of like the case in the book, the Congress gets very nervous because they say, well, that could be, I think in a way they say, oh, that could be me. I'm a white guy. What if I was on a reservation and I wasn't married or had, that kind of thing. So I think we're going to look for child abuse and drugs and see if we can't get sexual assault sort of squeezed in there at some point.
Well, it seems to me untenable, and I think probably a lot of non-Indians don't realize what a double bind this is. And certainly we hear it in the book in terms of particularly Joe's father, who struggles because he knows the whole thing and he works with it as a tribal judge. And so he's already anticipating as he goes through the process with his wife of the problems that it's going to be, and the possibility that the perpetrator is going to be somebody who will not be able to be prosecuted. In any case, let's move forward. When we get to the options for justice and healing without the criminal justice system, that's part of what we then hear in the story. And the judge, Joe's father and Geraldine's husband, on page 156, reassures her, and this is early, somewhat early in the story, but he reassures her, "I feel certain of it, Geraldine, there will be justice." So on some level, he's very much invested in the possibility and the reality that somehow, some way, there will be justice coming out of this. The discussion of justice focuses on Joe's struggle to understand it. And I thought it was ironic that he ends up going to the priest, Father Travis, and he's using the ruse of studying for confirmation to try to get the priest to show him how to shoot gophers in order to prepare him to shoot Lark, the rapist. And in the process of this learning, teaching with Father Travis, he gets into a fairly serious theological discussion about the sins crying out to heaven for vengeance. And clearly this is sort of new information to Joe in terms of his involvement in religious education in the Catholic Church, and we're going to talk more about that later. But Joe wants to know, what are the sins that cry out to heaven for vengeance? And Father Travis says, murder, sodomy, defrauding a laborer, and oppressing the poor. So in terms of Catholic doctrine, this would be the category. And then Joe says, I thought I knew what sodomy was and believed it included rape. So my thoughts were covered by church doctrine. So I was fascinated by how she kind of put those two pieces together in terms of Joe's already pretty clear what he's going to do in terms of going after Lark, but now he has some justification from someplace, he feels, to support him. And then there follows a discussion with Father Travis about good and evil. And he makes the distinction, again, in Catholic doctrine between material evil, being the things that cause suffering but are not the responsibility of individual acts, such as natural disasters, and moral evil, which is when a person does something deliberately to another person to cause suffering. So in making that distinction, then we're clearly dealing in this case with moral evil, the act of rape, something done deliberately to another person to cause suffering. And sort of hidden in this whole discussion is the question of why is there suffering, or why do people do these things, which in theological language is the problem of theodicy that folks in my business struggle with a lot, because it's there are many different answers to why is there suffering. And there's also the answer that I tend to go with, that we don't know why. But it always has been a challenge for human beings to come to terms with that question. Why is there any suffering? And again, the priest answers it sort of pro forma in terms of the doctrinal assumptions, and explains that it's because human beings have been given free will by God. And so when we've been given free will, then we exercise free will in ways that are hurtful to others. But then the priest goes on to assert that God can and does draw good from any evil situation, which I thought was a very interesting tack that he took. And he seemed to be focusing on that in tragedy, people do come together to help each other, which is generally the case. I mean, certainly we've been seeing that in recent weeks as the various experiences of the shootings and the murders in our various communities have been followed by communities coming together to help each other. So I think that's what the priest is getting at. But my sense as Joe was listening to this is that he was not convinced that good could come out of evil in this way. But as he plans his attack on Lark, he's come to believe that his vengeance is justified. And he says, I was dedicated to a purpose which I'd named in my mind, not vengeance, but justice. So he takes the formula and reverses vengeance and justice in order, I think, to make him feel somewhat more justified in what he's about to do. But clearly he's struggling with this. I mean, I think that's the point that Erdrich is trying to make. So he kills Lark with the help of his best friend, Cappy. And then they are both struggling with guilt and with nightmares in the face of what they've done. And then they go on a road trip together, and in the car accident, Cappy is killed. So Joe loses his best friend. And driving home with his parents, Joe says, I knew that they knew everything. The sentence was to endure. So let's talk a little bit about that whole piece in terms of the dealing with an act of vengeance in lieu of justice from the criminal justice system, and the struggle that Joe had and the way in which he frames it so that he's able to carry it out somewhat methodically, and once he makes up his mind, he just proceeds to carry it out. So what would be your thoughts on that whole segment?
Well, for me, it seems that when we get to the end of our rope, when we realize that we're in this all by ourselves, and that's what it feels like all too often, is that there isn't going to be justice coming over the mountain. There isn't going to be someone that's going to immediately be able to change things. I mean, even when Sarah's talking, she was like, in 2018, and in the meantime, we think about all of our women and children and men who are going to be suffering during that period of time, and what do we do about that? And then if you're in that place and it's your relative, and you know that justice is not something but a rare bird that comes in and flies in and then flies out often in our reservations, then you have to say, how am I going to personally respond? And in some ways, some reservations, nations, tribes, villages are saying, we're going to get rid of this person. We're going to ban them from, our reservation. That's something that we can do, an action that can be taken. I've seen relatives, elders take action one at a time, but it becomes exhausting. And so then it's a matter of saying, what am I going to do to make this balanced again and bring that in if nobody else is going to support the balance in a community and the justice for survivors. So I think I certainly can understand the frustration.
Have any of you seen this kind of revenge killing, if you will, that Joe participates in your own experiences? I mean,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have, and I remember a few years ago an assistant U.S. attorney asked me why some of the male-on-male crime on the reservation was so violent, like overkill, and more so than he saw in other places. And I said, well, there might be a story behind that. There might be a reason why somebody took revenge and was so angry and so became so dangerous in that place that we do see some really disfiguring and brutal homicides on some reservations. And I don't know that all of them are related to this, but when there's no justice for the women in your life, you know, there is that desperation that can come out. And my dad is a tribal court judge. My father's a tribal court judge, and he had a real problem with this book. I think that for him, he thinks that Indians are already stereotyped as sort of savage and vengeful anyway. And so as a tribal court judge reading this for him, he was very concerned about the image, right, of Indians as vengeful. And that troubled him greatly because he doesn't want that to be a stereotype. But what do you do when somebody doesn't have justice? You know, what choices can you make at that point? And I don't know that this is the right choice, but it may be the only choice for some people, and not acting on those instincts is a full-time job.
Don, what do you think?
Oh, I've not seen, or at least not been aware of killings as a response to this, but one of the first times that I became aware of this issue was an 18-year-old girl who had been raped on prom night, and already at that age had no interest at all in contacting the police. She knew there was no point, and her response was, I know who did it, and I have uncles and brothers. They're going to handle it. And a couple of nights later, I saw in the emergency room the results of that. Lived. I don't know how many may have not. One of the things I want to get back to as far as what you were saying about the closing of the book, when she writes that our sentence was to endure, I took that hour to be the largest hour, but it meant the whole, all tribal members, that you know, everyone knew, as it turns out, what he had done. You know, the Wishcob knew, Whitey knew, and they kind of, you know, kept their mouths shut and kept the story straight. And that certainly has been my experience, that everyone knows who the perpetrators are, what's going on, way before I ever did as an outsider in a community. So the sentence is to endure until hopefully Sarah's work is completed, and at least in this area.
And Don's work is complete.
Right. We wish, yes.
Yeah.
And I do. I think that's it. The families know this, and so the option for families is to met out that justice, and sometimes that's the only piece that you see that will be able to handle it. And I've seen it happen, and just like Don was saying, and just like this piece, is everybody knows and understands and doesn't do anything about it. And even if they were, I mean, then you think, then when something like that, then you watch the justice system come down on the person who has done that. That's when you see that all of a sudden the U.S. Attorney General's office wants to do something, and those types of things. But prior to that, there is no action on the assault itself. And I think that understanding the healing that can come from a system of, I will find that justice and I will perform that justice that occurs, and believing that that's their justice. And when you don't have anything else, then it becomes up to the reservation, the community, the people to decide.
I think that's the way the Basil, the father, the only way he could live with this realization that his son had murdered someone was to frame it in terms of a traditional justice, where he that the Linden had been overtaken by an animal spirit, and that in traditional ways it was okay to kill that person. But I don't know if the father could have. I don't know of any other way the father could have reconciled that
Well, and
visualization to himself. Yes.
I think the death of Cappy is really interesting. And when I assigned this to my law students, some of them, because they hadn't read fiction in a long time, were a little unclear about what happened to Cappy in the end. They're like, did he die? And I said, go back, read it slowly. Yes, you know, he was killed in the car wreck. And whether that's an intent by the author to really talk about things are going to balance out, right?
Mhm.
Cappy
Mhm.
took a life, Cappy's life is taken. And that the universe as a construct has a way of evening things out. And Cappy sacrificed himself for his close friend, and
Mhm.
that's a really powerful. For me, that was a really powerful realization.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's something, I mean, I find it interesting that the revenge component that he sought out wasn't found in tribal spirituality, and it wasn't found in, you know, the native way. It was found by an outside religious component, and it was like, this is it. This gives me that peace, that vengeful component. Because, like Sarah said, all too often, what we know in many of our reservations and our nations and our pueblos and our villages is that there is a piece that says that we honor all life, whether it be four-leggeds or two-leggeds or winged ones, we honor all life. We do ceremonies so that when we take the life of a deer, that you know, ends up being a sacred thing because we honor that life, we treat it right, and when that is needed to be killed for food, it is done in a very safe way. So when Cappy died, it was no surprise for Native community because there has to be that balance that says one life was taken, and how do we make that balance return to our community?
Mhm. Mhm. And we're going to look at that a little bit more in terms of the spirituality component from both the Native and the Catholic experience here. But before we get there, let's take a minute here, Elena, and talk about the historical trauma and racism, particularly that we read about in the story. Can you just enlighten us in terms of your experience?
When we look at historical trauma and we look at the colonization and we look at what occurred to our people, the taking of our land, the taking of our way of life, the cultural components, the taking of our religious way, because keep in mind that for a very long time, in many of our traditional ways, we were not allowed to practice those traditional ways. Then think about what it would be like for you to have your children taken away from you and taken hundreds, if not thousands of miles, and then where they suffered while they were in residential schools, the violence, the physical violence, the sexual violence that they suffered, as well as having their way of life taken away, the names taken away, their hair cut, which in so many of our nations and tribes, our hair is sacred to us, and what we do with our hair. And when we cut our hair, oftentimes in many nations, it's because we have lost someone, we're grieving for someone. And for, you know, little ones, when they had their hair cut in residential schools, one of the children said, I thought my mother had died because of, you know, my hair being cut. So then what kind of people do you think we're going to have in our communities when there has been that kind of suffering, and the one big lesson they learned was you don't talk about it, you don't say anything about it, and if you do, you're going to be punished. And if you, you know, and not only that, but the people that did this to our communities, the religious leaders, the, you know, people that we should trust of all people in our communities, these leaders, and then they were doing the harm to our community. So how do we form bonds of trust doing that? And when we have no one to talk to for the terrible and torturous things that happen to our community, how does a community recover from that? And we see that our communities have been hurt by this action in such a significant way, and having to endure this pain in silence has been an enemy for us for a long time. So now we can kind of name it, and we can kind of talk about it, and the more we talk about it, the more healing we can see. But in the meantime, when we look at his historical trauma, I kind of laugh at that because we still have current trauma. We still have these laws. We still have non-prosecution. We still have racism. We have the Washington Redskins. We have the Cleveland Indians. And in any other culture, we would say, you can't do this. You know, this racism cannot continue to pervade our communities, and yet we seem to have a pretty long ruler when we allow the kind of racism that occurs in our communities against our men, our women, our young men and our young women and our children, and it consistently happens. And so not only do we have historical trauma, but we have the current trauma of racism and endurance of what has occurred to us, and being able to forgive ourselves and be able to understand that the blame is not ours, but it is of those perpetrators who came a long time ago.
So for each of you, in terms of the work that you're doing at this point, what are you seeing as possible turning points and in beginning to address, you said, you know, the opportunity to speak about this and so forth. I assume that all of you are engaged in that. How are you seeing that going? I mean, how is it happening now? Or are people beginning to be able to really go back and deal with some of that historical stuff? Sarah, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I do think that Native women, I think it's really important. I've been really thoughtful about this since I read an article by a Native woman a few years ago named Eve Tuck. He wrote about suspending damage. Mm-hmm. And it's a really difficult thing to say we're damaged. There's something broken in us because of this history, when there is so much beauty and resilience out there, and so many Native people have, you know, thrived in spite of all of this. So it's difficult because you want to celebrate the resilience, but you also don't want to gloss over the deep-seated trauma that you find in many tribal communities. And I've been doing some research recently. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical person, but all of the links that have been made to health disparities with abuse. So people who've been abused have higher rates of lung disease and heart disease and liver disease, and those are all elevated in Indian country. So we know that trauma is beneath the surface for nearly every disparity that we struggle from. Suicide rates are sky high, right? And mental health, mental and substance addiction, all of these things are all connected to trauma. And if we don't address the trauma, then I think we'll not be able to address the disparities in mental health, suicide, that kind of thing. And so I like to celebrate the resilience of people who've made it despite, you know, the odds. And I put myself in that category. I was, you know, in my teens, I was a binge drinker, I was a cutter, and now I'm a MacArthur Fellow, right? So we need to celebrate Native women that succeed despite the trauma. But it's always there. It's always underneath everything.
Yeah. Don, how do you see it?
Well, I'm glad you pointed that out, that the health effects are so long-lasting. So that, for instance, a child who grows up in a home where there is domestic violence, even if that child is not abused in the sense that we normally think of child abuse, that child will be at greater risk as an adult in developing all of these healthcare problems that we're paying so much, and there's so much dispute about in our healthcare system now about how to pay for heart disease, lung disease, liver disease, the behavioral health issues that go along with the depression, the PTSD, the substance abuse. All of those things are regardless of race, that a child is at greater risk of suffering as an adult if they've witnessed this kind of violence as a child. I agree that we need to celebrate the endurance, if nothing, and the successes too, of course. One tribal member or leader said to me once that the reason we have survived as long as we have is because we were secretive about our ways. If we had been open and honest with, anyone, our ways would have been stolen or suppressed. I'm jumping around here a little bit. I just want to point out on this PowerPoint slide in front of us, or your fifth bullet point, that's talking about the Native communities, the historical struggles between the Native communities and the Catholic Church. It is not just the Catholic Church. There were many of the boarding schools that were run by non-Catholic churches also, and with the same levels of abuse taking place in those schools. And getting back to Elena with what she was talking about for historical trauma, there's kind of a U-shaped curve to what Sarah was talking about. When I talk with patients who have been either sexually or physically abused, my medicine often is not effective as far as the usual treatments for depression and PTSD. When we talk about the person seeking traditional healing, this is when, I don't know about you, Elena, but this is when I notice that people really start to, they know it on an intellectual level maybe, it's just that there's been historical trauma, but they've been so busy with life and with surviving that it hasn't been at the forefront of their thoughts perhaps, until they try to avail themselves of this knowledge that used to be, and they become aware of perhaps how little is left and how few resources are now available to help them heal in their own way. And there's a lot of anger and depression initially that comes with that realization before the curve starts to go back up on the other side of the U, and people can start to heal and grow and succeed.
One of the things that I think we've seen successful is talking about the historical trauma and removing the blame, because so many people take that on. And when we sit there and say, no, blame has never been yours, and removing that component from that has really seemed to be healing for many, many people. And we've had, Donna and I were part of Project Connect through Futures Without Violence, and part of what we were honored to be able to do was go into communities and talk about things like historical trauma and talk about effects that it might have for health, and really bring those two together. And it was very successful in being able to have that understanding, and there was some really good breakthroughs with different communities just by opening up that discussion and allowing people to realize that the blame that they had squarely placed on their shoulders was not theirs, and that they could realize that if you're trying to be a good parent and yet the only thing you were availed to was someone hurting you all the time at a residential school, that understanding that component is really critical to not having self-blame and learning those pieces. And it really had opened a lot of doors for us in that way. So we were really grateful to have that happen.
As well as that personal blame that some women try to lay on themselves, or do lay on themselves, when you point out that children who grow up in that kind of environment are more likely to have those health problems later in life, and some women take that, oh, I should have left the relationship sooner, I should have been, I should have. And again, pointing out, Elena, much better than I can, that you did not perpetuate this violence in this home, and so please stop blaming yourself for any health effects that your children may suffer.
Yeah, it's the paradox of the desire of a survivor to feel some control over their circumstances that inadvertently then makes them feel to blame for their circumstances. And I think that's a constant struggle in terms of helping anyone who's suffered certainly violence or trauma to be able to step back and see that, no, you know, as in the notion of you know, moral harm that we have in the book, that someone chose to do something to you, and then deal with that in and of itself.
Yeah, that needs to be emphasized continuously.
Yeah, yeah. So well, let's move forward and talk some. We're beginning to talk about the struggles between Native communities and the Catholic Church specifically here, because that's the faith community that the book is discussing. But you're absolutely right, Don, that everybody who had an institutional setting in which Native children were removed and taken to share responsibility for that part of the history. But what we hear in this, and this again is what I really appreciate about what Erdrich is doing in the book, is we hear the push-pull. She was raised Catholic, and she says that in her growing up and her learning, she preferred the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament to the Gospels. And she talked about it in terms of the stories being much more interesting to her and so forth. But when she got to learning the catechism as a youngster in Catholic school, then she found the catechism was about rules, and that there was usually rules about controlling women. And that was sort of the point where she said, okay, enough of this. But she talks about it at several points in the book. I want to go to page 59 and just quote this because it somewhat describes what you've been talking about. During the old days when Indians could not practice their religion, well, actually not such old days, pre-1978, the roundhouse had been used for ceremonies. People pretended it was a social dance hall or brought their Bibles for gatherings. In those days, the headlights of the priest's car coming down the long road glared in the southern window. By the time the priest or the BIA superintendent arrived, the water drums and eagle feathers and medicine bags and birch bark scrolls and sacred pipes were in a couple of motorboats halfway across the lake. The Bible was out and people were reading aloud from Ecclesiastes. Why that part of the Bible? I'd once asked Mushum. Chapter 1 and verse 4, he said, one generation passeth another, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. We think that way too. Sometimes we square dance, said Mushum, our highest, is it Bidet, priest with a damn fine collar. So they're really describing that period where the practice of Native spirituality was common but hidden. Because of the really oppressive control or the effort to oppressively control who they worshipped and in what context by the church. But then it was interesting that, there's the back and forth and portrayal of various members of the community who were very much Roman Catholic in terms of their orientation and their practice, and then others who have stepped away from it. Often for the adults, the history of the residential schools was part of what made that decision for them. But at the point at which Geraldine was still traumatically suffering and people were concerned about her and what they could do to help her, Edward says, what about the church? Would it help if Clemence, her sister, took her to church? You know what I think about it, of course, but there's a new priest she seems to like. I don't think Geraldine would find comfort there after all these years. We all knew that my mother had stopped going to church after she returned from boarding school. She never said why. And Clemence, her sister, never tried to get her to go either, that I knew of. So that within the same family, very different responses to Catholic teaching and practice. And then one other quote I just want to toss in here, and then we can talk about how we've seen that, is on page 249. And this is when Joe has decided that he's going to be taught to be confirmed by Father Travis. He says, I wasn't exactly starting from scratch when it came to being a Catholic. Priests and nuns have been here since the beginning of the reservation. Even the most traditional Indians, people who kept the old ceremonies alive in secret, either had Catholicism beaten into them or in boarding school, or had made friends with some of the more interesting priests, as Mushun had for a time, where they had decided to hedge their bets by adding the saints to their love of the sacred pipe. So here we have, and at least Elena, when you and I have talked about this, it's been my sense that this is a very typical setting in which there's both and but struggle within individuals and within families about whether to take on Christianity specifically as their faith community or whether to step away from it. So how do you all see that operating in the book here and in the issues?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. Certainly, it makes it very interesting, especially when you live in like a state of like New Mexico, where many of our pueblos, or all of our pueblos originally were named after saints. So like San Juan Pueblo, Santa Ana, so we have that mixture, and in almost every pueblo that we have has a Catholic church on that pueblo. So you have that mixture. And then you have the mixture of like the Navajo Nation, where the combination in some of the prayers and everything are combined with the native and the non-native, and especially the Catholics. So you'll hear, our fathers and things like that mixed in so that there's a combination there. And so now some of our pueblos here in the state of New Mexico, like San Juan, it returned to its original name, Okeawinge. So it went back to the land name, and the community was decided to do that. There has been a push in other native communities and native pueblos to do that and return to the names. What's interesting is the pushback comes from the elders who believe that the names should stay the same, and that's an honorable name, and that's where it should be. And the younger people are like, hey, wait, let's go back to our roots before we do that. And so I think it's striking, the effect, and I'm going to bring in one of the probably earth-shattering things that happened to me was when you and I did, we were in Minnesota and we were doing a seminar, and you had broken everybody up in a certain way. So it was, Jewish people in one room, you had Catholics in another, you had evangelicals, you had, Iman, the woman, to be able to help with that. And then we had the evangelical, and then we had a number of people that were native, and we decided to put that as, that native component. And there I sat in my room by myself until you came along and said, where are your people? And it was like, I don't know where my people are. And I mean, it was specifically called Native. It was Native American. And and we found our people in evangelical. Yeah. And I think for me, that was a very sad day, only because it wasn't called anything else. It was called Native American, and they chose to go to they identified evangelical before they identified as Native.
Right.
And so I think there's that push-pull that sometimes occurs in our communities, and there is a separation between elders and younger people who may want to return to that land name as opposed to a name that some people feel, was a conqueror name instead. And so it's a very interesting push between two agencies, and especially when a residential school that had a very bad effect in a community and was run by a church, and the division that occurs there as well.
Yeah. Sarah, what about your experience of this dilemma?
Well, I've been putting a lot of thought into this because my tribe is in Oklahoma, and I've been spending more time there. And there's definitely that buckle of the Bible Belt, right? But I try to think about. I've seen people try to incorporate or mesh their Christian, whatever Christian sect they're associated with their traditional ways. But some preachers, even Indian preachers in Oklahoma, will say, you can't go to the ceremonies, it's devil worship. But what I tried to sort of think about is there were people forced to convert, right, on threat of death or physical corporal punishment. But sometimes when the churches showed up, the tribes had already been brutalized by the soldiers and by the Indian agents, and the church came with food. The church came with some compassion, right? So it wasn't always a forced conversion. It was sometimes, these people are the only white people that have been good to us. And so I want to be part of that. So understanding the different reasons people became Christian or are Christian is really important, because it's not all the same kind of conversion.
Yeah, that's helpful to remember. Don, you have any comment?
Yes, I was raised as a very rigid, strict Presbyterian, so I've been impressed with how fluid these movements can be. There are some people who are strictly traditional and some who are strictly Christian, although I would agree with Sarah that that's usually folks who've gotten into the evangelical wing of Christianity, if you will. But I think most people are very comfortable moving back and forth between the two. The most dramatic example that I've seen is going to the funeral of one of my elderly patients, and she had a Catholic funeral in the Catholic church there in that village, and then was carried out, wrapped in a blanket, and then as soon as the people, I guess pallbearers who were carrying her, crossed the steps out into the unsanctified ground, I guess, the priest just turned on his heel. He was actually asked to leave the Pueblo later because he thought this was devil worship too. But as soon as the people crossed over out of the church property, he just turned on his heel and walked away, and then she was buried in a very traditional way. And that's as the way she would have wished. So,
yeah.
Many of our Native elders will pray with that Catholic component and feel very positive about that, and yet still will go to a sweat lodge. So you'll see oftentimes this combination of the two, where they may, and even in lodges, you will hear them pray with, saying God and those types of things, and feel very comfortable with that. And you see a lot of elders who have found a way to make peace with both sides of their history and their journey, that they've been able to do that. And you see other people who have maybe been traumatized during those periods of time to make that separation, but still may practice because they feel that has been something that has given them solace or has helped them heal in some way.
Well, it's a complex
yeah, just
dimension. Yeah. but I think it comes through very clearly in the book, and the number of people that in some ways make reference to that internal conflict. So let's move on to the last thing, and then see if Sarah has any questions for us. But just to conclude this, talking about Native spirituality as a possible source for justice and healing, and a couple of places that I think we hear that in the book. And I have a question for you all about this. On page 187, where Mushum, who's Joe's grandfather, is telling a story, and it's kind of a complicated story in terms of who's doing what to whom and so forth. But the conclusion is that one of the characters says, Wendigo justice must be pursued with great care. Can anybody speak to what Wendigo means?
I'll put in my 2 cents. I mean,
Okay.
really what you're looking at is, you know, that cultural component is that evil spirit, and the evilness comes from the ability to be self-absorbed, and that evilness comes to, it doesn't matter what anybody else needs, wants, I am going to do what I need to do. So it's so self-absorbed. And now, oftentimes, that is something that is seen with tremendous greed or destruction of our environment. They'll often talk about and use that as a particular statement about somebody when they're destroying our, you know, our lands or things like that. They will talk about that, and they'll talk about the destruction. It's kind of a monster. It's something that's big and that takes over. And the interesting thing is that although it's used in this term this way, there are a number of people that have versions of that with a slight different spelling, or have that piece as that component that talks about the evilness that can be so self-consuming that makes someone do something so terrible in their community, like a rape, and that they're doing it only to feed themselves and nothing else. And so it's really that monster, that destruction, that greed, that self-absorption.
Okay, that's really helpful to think about how it's used in this context with that clarity. But then they go on page 196 and talk about Anishinaabe justice. And this is where I think it's the judge is talking about what we would need to do with this individual. We would have to sit down to decide his fate. So if the individual were brought to accountability, what is she saying here in terms of the process that might be used to decide his fate?
Well,
I think,
go ahead, Doctor.
I think Nana Push pointed out that in his story, that ends with him finding the mother buffalo, he pointed out that it had to be a group decision, that one person could not make that decision by themselves, which is something Joe ignored or Joe's father ignored when he was trying to use that justification for Joe murdering the white man. Anyway.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Elena.
I think Sarah was going to talk.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So in my tribe, the Muskogee people, we had in the 19th century, we were sort of a transition between our traditional ways and the old Wild West. And so we actually had corporal punishment, whippings, for people who committed crimes like this. But I think what's really important here is that we would have sat down to decide his fate, is that a lot of that was very consensus-based. So we had we did fact-finding sort of like our juries do in the Anglo-American system, right? You have to all agree. And sometimes in our tribal justice systems, whether you're talking about like what happened in the 1300s versus the 1800s, you know, you do see this consensus-based decision-making, and not just the criminal sector, but in all kinds of sectors, about selecting a leader, for example. You know, elections were consensus-based, so it took a really long time to pick a leader. But I think that's what he's referring to here, is that sort of Old West kind of Anishinaabe justice.
Okay, very good. That makes sense.
Don disappeared on us, or I don't have him on.
Yeah, Don, have you gone?
Yeah,
Don.
I'm trying to get him back. We'll see.
Okay.
He might have lost his internet connection.
Yeah, it was
What?
bad a minute ago. So one other reference to that, on page 206, it could be argued that Lark, the rapist, met the definition of
Wendigo.
Okay. And that with no other recourse, his killing fulfilled the requirements of a very old law. So is that back to what you were talking about, Elena, in terms of if a community identified such a person, that they needed to take some action?
I think, you know, back in the day, like Sarah was talking about, you know, it was something that was seen and done a lot differently than once the kind of westernized justice came in. When you keep in mind that some of the reason, you know, back in the day, like one of the reasons this whole component of Major Crimes Act came about was that it started with like a crow dog who had committed a crime, who had shot and killed someone on the reservation, and the tribal council dealt with that, and they said, okay, this is what you need to do according to Sioux tradition, you know, Lakota tradition. This is what you need to do. This is how we're going to handle it. You're going to pay restitution. You're going to continue to help this this family. You're going to do those things. And it was the United States government that basically didn't feel that, the U.S. authorities didn't feel that that was good enough, that there had to be someone behind bars and doing all of that. And so then, you know, Crow Dog then was sentenced in and found guilty in that component. And then when the family comes forward and says, you know, we're still looking for this restorative piece, they're like, look, he's in jail, there's no reason, you know, he has already paid for that crime. You look at how that system started to fall apart in all of those different components, and looking at how, you know, there still is that piece that our traditional ways allow for in, you know, being able to ban someone or give them, you know, a certain amount of justice, giving the victim justice, but it's all a matter of, you know, bringing all of those components together and agreeing on how that is. And that's not a quick, easy thing to do, you know, but there are many nations that are starting to take a better look at that. I know Sarah knows a lot about those components.
Mm-hmm. With the goal of restoring relationships and community.
Yeah, it's very interesting because you do have, again, what's difficult about talking about issues in Indian country is we tend to lump all tribes together, right? And we're so different. We have such divergent worldviews and belief systems. And there are some tribes that traditionally would show zero tolerance, and you're either capital punishment or you're leaving the community for life, right? If you hurt a child, if you hurt a woman in that way. And then there's other tribes that have more restorative principles and would like to sort of bring those back. You know, sometimes I think it was Karen Artichoker that said to me, you know, some women are really tired of throwing our men away, even if they're doing terrible things. So I think there's a need to really honor the legal traditions of a particular community and understand the legal traditions, and then determine whether or not they should be, you know, they need to be modified or they need to be contemporized, made contemporary. And that's a journey that each tribal nation has to do when they're thinking about resolving these kinds of terrible crimes.
And you look at how many of our nation, I mean, how many of our nations, whether they're federally recognized or state recognized, for every one of those nations, they have a different way of processing both their political ways, their cultural ways, and allowing for that process to take place in an honorable way with a hands-off approach from the U.S. government would be a really good thing to be able to have in that way.
Yeah. Okay. Very, very, very helpful to clarify those concepts. But I want to check in with Sarah and see if there's any particular questions we haven't covered.
There are actually. Looks like Don is back. He had a power outage, but he's on his way back in.
Okay.
So we had someone write in and say that they were struck by the comparison with To Kill a Mockingbird in terms of a discussion of a loss of innocence, which you've all talked about, as well as race relations. And I wonder if any of you had anything to say about that.
Well, they're both books that law students should read.
Spoken as a law professor.
Yeah.
And I thought that Basil, Joe's dad, was a much more believable Atticus Finch than, he kind of came down off his pedestal and he was a real person, a real father in this book. I love To Kill a Mockingbird, don't get me wrong, but this was a much more believable Atticus Finch than the Mockingbird.
Yeah. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, so I want to think some more about that. But I would certainly agree with you, Don, that the portrayal of Basil is very nuanced and has real depth, I think, in terms of his struggle and his from so many different directions, personally, professionally, as a father, and so forth. It's very full character, I think, in the book. Other questions, Sarah?
Yeah, so there's a question about the PTSD of the victim and the secondary drama of the son and father as it's represented in the book. You want to talk about that?
Well, I think it is represented in the book very well. That's why the book is so painful.
Yeah, I do think that that's exactly right. And you get the idea. Oftentimes people forget that when a rape or an abuse or violence happens in a family, they think that it's only the person, the victim or the survivor, that has suffered. And yet we see over and over that it's not only the survivor but the community, the relatives of those, and the damage that it does not only to the victim but also the relatives, which is very well played by the family, the father, and how he begins to act differently and be more watchful over his wife and feel more vulnerable than he's ever felt before, even though he was entrenched in the system that he knows is now failing. He always knew that that was a piece of it with the whole lasagna piece, but at the same time, having to live it and breathe it is a completely different thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other thoughts on the secondary trauma?
Well, I think, I was, again, not reading a lot of fiction. I was shocked when I realized in the first page that this was a little boy, essentially. That was going to be the star of the story, because I find myself, I'm so survivor-centric, like I'm worried about the survivor, that sometimes I do forget, the kind of pain the rest of the family is going through. And, there's not enough advocates to go around. So if there's not enough advocates to go around, advocates are focusing on survivors, and we're maybe not able to do the same kind of work to support family members. And so there's a lot of suffering that happens that may not get addressed by sort of the advocacy community.
Yeah, and I think it's... Go ahead, Don. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I read this for the second time. It's been a few years, but those first few pages just blew me away, where he is picking the little seedlings out of the foundations, and if they'd been allowed to grow, they would have destroyed the foundations of his home.
Mm-hmm.
And that meticulous picking away at these things is what we're stuck with at this point, anyway, in trying to deal with this kind of abuse and trauma that affects the entire community.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is a move for the advocates when we have advocates, like Sarah was saying, when we have advocates, that there is a move to work with the whole family, primarily because you have no other choice. When we look at transportation to get them from point A to point B, or when we look at supporting them when they're most fearful, or when they need to go into their doc or sane person to be able to get that, because the transportation needs, those types of things are critical. And so, but I don't think there's enough for children who have witnessed or been witness to the destruction of a human being, like with Geraldine, and the feelings that he had, not knowing what to do and how to make it better, and maybe even giving those tools. You realize that if he had maybe even a few little tools, that he wouldn't feel so helpless in that situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was interesting that he had, the sort of support of the community and of the whole family, the extended family and so forth. He had all these people in his life, which I think was great for him, because he could go to various people to be with when he couldn't stay at home or was struggling with something. And so that was kind of already in place for him. But as he went through, at each point that he was learning something new in terms of information about what happened, and he asked a lot of questions, and he wanted to know, and his father was struggling with how much do I really disclose to him and so forth. But his development through that, you basically watch him grow up in the space of the summer into really an adult who's making adult decisions. And, how do we accompany a child through that as an advocate or support person? So we need to close, and thank you, Don, for bringing us back to that image on the first page, because I think that is a powerful image that she uses as a starting point, and it does reflect on what all of us are trying to do as we work kind of in day-to-day in dealing with these structures that are not serving us very well. But I want to conclude with a quote from Joe from page 315, just as to kind of pull us together. He said, they had built that place, the roundhouse, to keep their people together and to ask for mercy from the Creator, since justice was so sketchily applied on earth. So let me just read it again. They had built that place, the roundhouse, to keep their people together and to ask for mercy from the Creator, since justice was so sketchily applied on earth. Which I kind of felt like summed up the story in terms of the absence of justice and asking for mercy for whatever we do in place of where justice should be to respond to crimes like this. So let me thank all of you. Don Clark for joining us, Sarah Deere for joining us, Elena Giacci for joining us. It's been a very rich conversation, and all of you have contributed in a significant way. So I'm so glad we were able to get together this way, and glad to meet the two of you. I hope our paths will cross again. And we have on the screen, our next book will be Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. And this is as far as I'm concerned, this is a classic in the field, and continues to be a significant, I think, contribution, even though it's probably 15 years old. But my interest in it is I want to go back and read it again now, having used it often in the work that I've done, and see what I think about it now in retrospect. So I invite you all to do that. If you have read it before, please read it again. And we'll have that part of the discussion when we meet again in September. So thank you all very much. Carry on. Keep doing your good work. Blessings. And I hope we'll see each other again.
Bye,
Okay.
everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us today.
Yes.
So,
Anything else?
audience members, as we close up, you will be asked to fill out a survey. So if you would please do that, we would appreciate it. We'd like your feedback, your ideas, book suggestions. So thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sarah. Good night.
Night.
Thank you.